Modern Africa includes over 40 nation-states, many of which contain a great variety of cultures and religions. Some observers have estimated that as many as 1,000 languages are spoken on this great continent. Much of Africa's variety can be traced to its very long history and its extraordinarily diverse geography. There are 4 main deserts in Africa: the Kalahari in the southwest, the Libyan in the north, the Nubian to the northeast, and the Sahara, which stretches from the Nile River in the east to the Atlantic Ocean in the west. The Sahara alone covers 3.5 million square miles, almost 1/3 of Africa. Many nomads and herding tribes have long eked out a living in these desolate areas. Yet Africa also is a land of teeming jungles, spacious rangelands, and majestic mountains. Many rivers splash and meander through this terrain. The longest African river, indeed the longest river in the world, is the Nile, which runs over 4,000 miles from Lake Victoria to the Mediterranean. On the banks of this ancient river, pharaohs built their tombs. Moses was said to have been drawn from its waters. African civilization has long been shaped by great migrations of people across these waters from other continents and cultures. It is a large collection of societies shaped by an unusually large variety of influences. African religions are as varied and diverse as its cultures, but there also have been unifying influences, particularly Christianity and Islam. In the last decade of the 20th century, Africa's religious makeup has included well over 300 million Christians and just under 300 million Muslims. There are about 70 million followers of traditional African religions and about 1.5 million Hindus. Only about 30 to 40% of African people practice indigenous religions, or what religious historians often call African traditional religions. Indigenous beliefs have survived by blending with Christianity and Islam. Such a blending or combining is called syncretism, a widespread phenomenon in religious and cultural history. Traditional African religions have continued to be present among the ethnic societies that historians call traditional peoples. These societies are mostly in the sub-Saharan region, near or below the equator. Traditional African religions tend to be structured around dramatic performances rather than philosophical discourse. The dramatic performances tend to be sensual. Sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch are all engaged in connecting the spiritual world of gods and ancestor spirits to the social world of traditional devotees. Masks and special clothing, herbs and food, dancing and sacrifices, shouting, singing, and ecstatic utterances all have important functions in African traditional religions.
The broad overview of the indigenous African religions really entail quite a bit of concepts and precepts. Africa is such a diverse country, or continent, that just to pinpoint one particular religion of Africa is somewhat difficult to do unless we would speak about Olodumare, who is the supreme God or the supreme being to most Africans. However, that term may be used in different aspects or languages, in which may differ from the Olodumare that the Yoruba people know. There are many sub-religions within the religions of Africa itself. So therefore, Africa in religion is not on a Sunday morning. It is a daily basis, and so any particular group may have their special deity that they prefer, and then there may be an ancestral type thing.
Through dramatic performances at feasts and worship, spirits and gods enter the devotees and are re-embodied. In their embodiment, the spirits admonish and guide the devotees in matters of piety as well as in economic matters. But sometimes they may also bring harm. African traditional religions also tend to be oral rather than literary, transmitting beliefs and teachings through a variety of verbal arts rather than scripture. Myths and folklore, riddles and proverbs, and sometimes songs and poetry are all involved. Some African Christian theologians see a possibility for a new age of religious independence in Third World Africa. Some see the indigenous church phenomenon as a sign of a new age or a new outpouring of the Holy Spirit.
About 25 to 30 years ago, Africa had begun to recast herself and really look into her indigenous ways and methods of worshiping. I remember many of them telling me that, yes, when the missionary comes, they bring out the piano, roll it out, and they begin to sing the droll songs that they would call them and this and that. They said, but as the missionaries would return, then they would get the tom-tom, as they called it, the drums, and they would begin to go back into their indigenous feelings. We look upon Africa now as Africa is able now to practice her religious aspects of spirituality the way she wants to and not governed by the colonials.
African separatist movements originally thrived by converting followers of traditional religions either to Christianity or to Islam. But the more recent revival of African traditional religion is different. It attempts to rediscover or reaffirm traditional African practices after centuries of Christian and Muslim domination. Some African traditional religions in the past have taken the form of secret societies. Now, secret societies have become yet another element of Africa's neo-traditional movements. Some African theologians suggest that revitalized traditional religion could eventually become unified with African Christianity and Islam. Some even speculate that these unified forces could someday unite Africa as one nation. It is now commonplace to say that myths construct the world. Especially for African traditionalists, myths are exceptional, exemplary stories that are full of sacred and moral significance. Some African myths address moral behavior by explaining why certain practices must be done one way and not another. But other myths express traditional moral values and attitudes toward the realities of traditional African experiences. Myths and folklore, along with other oral arts such as riddles and proverbs, thus have a social function in connecting everyday life to transcendent meaning. Despite generations of contact with other dominant religions, the Yoruba have managed to preserve virtually intact the traditional myths that have long organized their religious practices. The Yoruba people are one of the largest religious groups in West Africa, numbering some 15 million people. Although they inhabit much of Nigeria, the Yoruba also inhabit countries stretching from Benin to the Niger River. The Yoruba are not merely a tribe. They once were a flourishing civilization, supported by farming and industry. Yoruba religion is often associated with polytheism, but such an identification grossly misunderstands the nature of Yoruba religion as well as its myths, folklore, and rituals. The Yoruba religion does embrace a pantheon of divinities, but all these gods are manifestations of one supreme deity.
The Ifa Orisha structure or pantheon starts from Olodumare, which is translated as the controller of the universe. That entity would be known as our supreme being. From that entity, we have the Orisha. These divine beings are various expressions of the Supreme Being who were charged by the Supreme Being to create the world.
This common version of the Yoruba creation myth discloses something about the relation between Olodumare and the lesser divinities called Orishas. Each Orisha is a representation or manifestation of Olodumare's power, but none is Olodumare. Only Olodumare is supreme.
The other deities play a very important role. They're more active in human affairs. The Supreme Being is kind of represented by these other deities who each have their own shrine, have their own priesthood, have their own set of taboos and sacred objects and sacred places, and govern particular aspects of human behavior or of our global condition, and you don't really have that in the Western religious form.
Olodumare actually recedes into the background of Yoruba mythology, but his power and presence is manifested and communicated in myths that personify nature and nature's processes. The earth, the rivers, lagoons and seas, all are respected as persons or gods. Sometimes Olodumare is even portrayed as some great person who lived long ago. Orisha Nla, sometimes called Obatala, is a manifestation of Olodumare. This Orisha, or lesser god, is the creator, the shaper of human forms. Although Obatala usually is androgynous, he is most often described as male. He is the maker of babies in the womb. He even creates the deformed and the misshapen, so to mock these unfortunate creatures is to mock Obatala himself. It is not altogether clear just what the relationship is between Obatala and the other Orishas. But according to Yoruba mythology, apparently there is a hierarchy of Orishas. Some have their origin from Olodumare himself. According to the first version of the creation myth, these Orishas originally abide with Olodumare in the heavens, and they assist Obatala in his creative work. These Orishas are also primordial deities. Among them are Eshu, Shango, Ile, and Orunmila. Orunmila also bears the title Babalawo, the father of mysteries. He is sent with Obatala to give guidance. Eshu, another primordial Orisha, is represented in Yoruba mythology as the prankster. In fact, a prankster or trickster appears in many African traditional mythologies. Muslims and Christians often associate Eshu with Satan, the accuser or deceiver. The association is not altogether misleading because Eshu challenges and he tests. He also has great knowledge of the secret desires and destinies of devotees.
Eshu is the owner of all decisions, because decisions are located at a crossroad. That means you go one way, you go the other, you decide this, you decide that. So Eshu is the Orisha that a worshiper would appeal to for assistance and clarity in making this decision.
Eshu provokes strife and wrong behavior among persons in order to form virtue among them, and in this way he ultimately causes moral order and religious devotion. He's often represented in a human shape, with horns on its head and with a club or knife nearby. Sometimes he is a little man who, while being pompous, is also self-conscious of his small stature. In some traditions, Eshu is represented by a phallus. In Yoruba myths, he is almost always near calamity, and in one myth he even causes calamity among the other primordial Orishas. Shango, like Obatala and Eshu, is a primordial deity. Finally, Ile, or Mother Earth, is another of the primordial orishas. It is believed that at birth we rest on her, and at death we return to her womb. And at every meal, the ancestors who dwell in her are honored with a few drops of drink poured on the ground. Ogun, the divinity of war and the patron of iron, lives on the edge of society. He is the patron of hunting and foresters. Ogun is innovative, aware of what's happening in other societies. He is in touch with the spirits in skies, wood, grassland, and technology. It is said that where two pieces of iron are put together and his name called upon them, Ogun is there. Among the Shona of Zimbabwe, ancestors are the intercessors between the supreme god and the community of the living. The Shona believe that the supreme god is a metaphysical being that does not interact directly with the human community. Spiritual relations between gods and humans are understood to occur through the ancestors, who as spirits can communicate with the high god. But Shona ancestors also are human spirits who remain connected to their earthly society. Yet, however human beings may be conceived among traditional people, they're almost always connected to the divine world, either by their spirit or by destiny. Ancestor devotion implies interdependency because ancestors mediate the community's life with the divine life. Ancestors actively participate in both the realms of the dead and the living. The Jogi, which are the plural of Jok, are not always either friendly or evil presences at certain shrines. These spirits and powers also are involved in the society's conflicts with other Jogi. Some of these Jogi are thought to bring about calamity, especially sickness. The Acholi practice rituals to appease or extirpate them, sometimes by long and tortuous ordeals. The Acholi healing ritual first involves a practitioner, a diviner, who diagnoses an affliction as having been caused by a joke. Joined by the attendants and the family, the healer and his or her assistants will sing joke songs. Drums and rattle gourds will be used to sound various rhythms. In the process, sometimes the joke might possess the healer, causing him or her to shake violently. If this happens, the ritual will stop. The healer may have to call for someone with more experience, seniority, and strength in order to continue the treatment. Traditional African medicines are made from tree bark, sap, and extracts from roots and other herbal sources. But as we've observed in the Acholi ritual healing, pharmaceutical treatment and divination cooperate in restoring vitality to one whose sickness is understood essentially to be a spiritual ailment. The Yoruba, like others committed to African traditional religions, regard human beings as composite. The spirit returns to Olodumare, the supreme deity, while the body returns to Ile, Mother Earth. After a death, and on certain other occasions, traditional Africans will celebrate in a dancing ritual called the Egungun. The Egungun celebration is exclusive in its performance. Women and children are forbidden to come near this spirit, which is also to come near the dead. But the Gelede is the most inclusive of Yoruba feasts and ceremonies. The Gelede primarily honors the ancestresses, and women and children are essential to its power. Two revolutions directly and profoundly affected African culture and religion. The first revolution was a technological advance that made it possible to establish a slave trade in the Atlantic basin. The second revolution was an economic development that made the slave trade highly profitable. Some 10 million Africans were transported to the Americas over the next few centuries, and their traditional religions went with them.
When Africans were brought to America and enslaved, it was those very priests and priestesses acting in secrecy who served as doctors, for one, but also they were able to keep that identity alive, and they were able to really project a kind of spiritual force and energy that allowed people to survive through those devastating kinds of circumstances.
With the invention of sailing ships that could sail closer to the wind, and with improvements to ship hulls and rigs, Portuguese mariners by the early 15th century could successfully navigate south to Senegal in northwest Africa and still return north. This opened an effective route from Europe to sub-Saharan Africa. A second revolution stimulated the transatlantic slave trade when the Portuguese exported the Mediterranean plantation system to the South Atlantic basin. This revolutionized the economics of sugar production. When the skilled managers of the Dutch West Indies Company expanded this system throughout the Caribbean and North America, there soon followed an explosion in the demand for labor, slave labor in particular. Because of the increasing demand for sugar in Europe, land for sugar production had to expand beyond the small designated farms of the Mediterranean. The plantation system, which originally had developed as a system of capital, now grew to become a system of land investment, industrial processing, slave labor, and a closed managerial system. Slaves were regularly bought and sold as capital assets in the Mediterranean, an area primarily controlled by Muslims and Christians. Navigation between Portugal and West Africa now effectively opened the sub-Saharan slave trade to early European capitalists. The practice of chattel slavery now was widely expanded. The Portuguese were the first to spread the practice to the Atlantic basin, and they were the first to supply the American system of sugar production with African slaves. The Brazilian and South Atlantic plantation system became the model for producing other goods in other markets. In the southern regions of North America, the plantation system was copied in Virginia's production of tobacco, South Carolina's production of rice and indigo, and the production of cotton in other areas east of the Mississippi. All this required a cheap labor force to keep pace with European consumption and demand. And the answer became the transatlantic African slave trade. Of the approximately 10 million slaves who entered the plantation system in the Americas between 1502 and 1860, between 500,000 and 700,000 were brought into North America. The rest either went to Central or South America. Some 30 to 50 million other Africans died either during the ocean crossing, while confined in holding pens at African slave ports, or in African tribal wars, which were sparked by the distorting influence of the slave trade. The first African slaves were initially exported from West Africa, but the Portuguese, Spanish, and particularly the Dutch soon navigated their way to Central Africa as well. Traditional African religions are fundamentally oriented towards rituals that seek some favor, advantage, or guidance from the ancestor spirits. The performative aspects of African religion include many phenomena related to magic, such as charms, amulets, shrines, divination, and spirit possessions. In fact, these magical phenomena characterize African religions just as much as the oral arts we discussed earlier. The functions of African charms and amulets are actually related to powers, spirits, lesser deities, and ghosts.
This African fetish, which is really a kamisi in African language, meaning it's a power figure. And it is looked upon as a person and not as a carving. And is used for various methods of healing or revenge or whatever the nature may be. And you notice here they have blades in this fetish. And there are few nails. Where before the colonials came, the Africans used the blade. The same type of blade they would take from the spears. They would use a blade to put into the fetish. To give you a good example, if I'm the medicine man, I'm the chief priestess of spirituality and healing in the village, and one of my villagers come to me and they would ask me and say, listen, there is a pain in my side. The spiritual man or the medicine man would take and drive a wedge or blade in this particular object right where the person is complaining about the pain. Then this object, this fetish, this kamisi catches all of that pain. And the person will come back and tell the high priest or the medicine man, say, listen, I'm all right, I'm healed. And so all these blades that you see mean the number of times that people have come to the medicine priest in order for healing.
African traditionalists experience religions as an encounter with strange powers and presences, both human and spirit. And many of these powers may threaten the well-being of the community and of individual persons. Misfortune also may be understood to be the work of benevolent spirits who may inflict misfortune in carrying out their roles as guardians of tradition. Many misfortunes also may be accredited to the power of witchcraft. Among the Baluba, a witch is a strange and often introverted or antisocial person. He or she may dwell on the outskirts of the village. Such persons are thought to be accompanied by powers that can both disrupt and destroy. Coming to peace with these powers requires powerful medicines and an expert class of practitioners who can root out and destroy malevolent spirits, or at least establish a livable peace with them. Elements of traditional African religion were first exported from sub-Saharan West Africa to Brazil in the 16th century, but they did not flourish until the mid-19th century. Many traditional African cults took root. Brazil's various cults place the spirit medium in a central role, with special emphasis on both spirit possession and divination. Divination evokes the help of the spiritual world for those who are suffering misfortune in the world of the living. It is a stable aspect of mediumship, and in Brazil, divination remains vitally connected with comparable functions in Africa. Afro-Brazilian cults, like the traditional religions of Africa, strongly emphasize performances such as speeches and dances, drumming and sacrifices. Ceremonies are dramatic, colorful, and ecstatic. They evoke the age-old powers and presences of both divinity and saints. Afro-Brazilians have not always been supported or encouraged to openly practice traditional religion. Their religious practices have been both forbidden and prosecuted. To be sure, the association of orishas with the Christian saints has given them a certain legitimacy among the predominantly Roman Catholic populace of Brazil. Afro-Brazilians actually have become very much a part of both local and national government operations throughout Brazil and other regions. The various Afro-Brazilian cults are often drawn into debates about authenticity, usually involving the question of whether a cult can reliably associate its practices with original African tradition. Among the Caribbean cults that have gained the attention of religious historians, none is more readily studied than Haitian voodoo. Yet by the same token, voodoo also is greatly misunderstood. As in the Brazilian cults, those who practice voodoo are descended from West African peoples. Voodoo is particularly associated with Haitians and the Creoles of New Orleans. It is a hybrid of traditional African religious experience and Roman Catholic practices.
When the Africans came here, especially most of them came through the port of New Orleans and Charleston, South Carolina. Now those who came through New Orleans and Charleston, South Carolina came directly from Africa. All the others came from the islands. They had been indoctrinated or broken in the islands or in the Caribbean, the West Indies. But those coming in from Charleston, those coming in from New Orleans, came directly from Africa. That is the reason you have in South Carolina and New Orleans, around that part, many, many traces of the indigenous African religion of Vodou.
Voodoo is the worship of traditional African divinities from the ancient Fon people who were born in the kingdom of Dahomey, which is now known as Benin. And their system developed in Haiti as Haitian Voodoo. There are some small derivatives of individual practices of Voodoo that landed in the southern part of the United States by virtue of the slave trade through two major cities. One is New Orleans and the other one is Virginia. But they did not develop the religion, as it were. It stayed more on an individualized ritual level, or where people would do individual things that were part of the religion. But the divinities, in terms of how they are worshipped in Haiti, did not travel to this land to stay for long.
In Haitian voodoo, the controlling principle is the loi, a class of spirits, manifestations, spiritual powers, and presences. The relationship between the devotees and the loi is performative, dramatic, and magical, just as it was in the cult of the ancestors in Africa. The practice of voodoo has begun to recede as Haiti has neared the end of the 20th century. One of the causes of voodoo's decline is the decay of large extended rural families. Another cause is the fragmentation of large cults into smaller cults, led by inadequately trained priests. Still another cause is poverty, which has caused a flood of voodoo devotees to turn to an urban life. In the cities, these devotees are distracted from traditional agrarian concerns and the demands of ancestral spirits. Nevertheless, the voodoo cult is still a vigorous belief system throughout the Caribbean basin and parts of North America. Among the lesser-known Afro-Caribbean religions is Santeria, a traditional religion that's practiced primarily in Cuba and Puerto Rico. Santeria, which means the worship of the saints, preserves distinct elements of Yoruba religion in the New World. Indeed, its central deity is Olodumare, the Yoruba high god. The Orishas, or lesser gods of the Yoruba tradition, are venerated as guardian angels by devotees of Santeria.
Various versions of Yoruba are practiced among Hispanic people, where it's evolved into a practice called Santeria. The Yoruba religion got kind of fused with the French Catholicism. Some of the deities from the Yoruba religion were converted to saints, as it were, so that correspondence existed, and they were able to kind of transfer many of those same religious concepts into a more acceptable form. So the Santeria and the Yoruba are very closely connected.
The author, Miheni Gonzalez Whippler, notes that each follower of Santeria uses divination to determine which Orisha is assigned as his or her guardian deity. Santerians believe in spirit possession, where the Santeros are possessed or mounted by the Orishas or saints. In such possessions, the Santero becomes the medium by which an Orisha or saint speaks face to face with the devotees. All of this involves a long and complicated system of initiation for each devotee of Santeria.
Love is a virtue of the Lord Almighty, which we on earth must strive to accomplish. To attain and maintain our true loving spirit, we must sacrifice and nurture the spirit daily. Omitutu represents the coolness of Eji Agbe. Purification, good character, and long life. May we both have Omitutu. Are you buying it? Ache, a tu pues. Ache. Un momentito. Okay, I'm ready. Before we go out, may you kiss the bride. Mira, está muy corto. ¿Cómo es que pasó? Vámonos. Okay.
Cuba's Spanish Catholic slave owners once associated Santeria with devilcraft, and devotees were subject to persecution, so its practices were long conducted under great secrecy. Like voodoo, Santeria is still shrouded in secrecy, and also like voodoo, outsiders regard Santeria as exotic and diabolical. Santeria is viewed suspiciously, particularly because sacrifice has a central role in its rituals, and blood sacrifice may well be practiced when the spiritual stakes are high. Neo-traditional African cults are not as prevalent in the United States as they are in the South Atlantic Basin. The study of African American religion in the United States tends to be tied to the cultural ascendancy of African American Protestantism, as opposed to African American Catholicism, African American Islam, and African neo-traditional cults. This emphasis on African American Protestantism is primarily based on the history of contact between African slaves and Protestant British colonists. In other words, it was American Protestantism that legitimized the institution of slavery in the US. And so it was Protestantism that the early slaves were exposed to. Sociologists such as C. Eric Lincoln and Lawrence Mamiya tend to describe African American Christianity in North America in terms of the black church. Sociologically, the black churches are said to be constituted by any black Christian person if he or she is a member of a black congregation. The black churches, thus defined, are the 7 major, independent, historic and totally black-controlled denominations, and together they claim some 80% of black church memberships at the end of the 20th century.
Certainly one thing we would have to say that has carried over from the traditional African religions and is present throughout all of African American culture and in the religion too is the music. You know, the music, the singing, the gospels, the gospel music, the spirituals, just that whole body of religious performance, I guess, which is very much part of the African expressiveness, the way everybody in the congregation becomes involved and people jump up and shout and dance and are moved, and the rhythm of the service, you know, how it works up, it builds up to an intensity and then it comes down, and it definitely has a pattern, and it has a format that allows and encourages everyone to participate and everyone to be involved.
While African American churches are identified with Protestant denominations, Lincoln and Mamiya suggest that these black churches also are related to African traditional religions in a conceptual and moral way. They explain the relation in terms of what they call a black sacred cosmos, which is a parallel universe to European Christianity. The idea of the black sacred cosmos is in part a response to other sociologists who hold that African American churches are just aberrational attempts to mimic mainstream white culture. These other sociologists say that African American churches exhibit no exceptional elements that would distinguish them from European Christianity and culture. But for sociologists like Lincoln and Mamiya, African American churches are religious and moral alternatives to North American mainline denominations.
We will not live in fear because we are children of God. And when it's all over down here, and when the night will no longer crowd in upon us, and when we'll no longer stand on the banks of this river, we'll be able to declare, like Martin King declared, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last.
African American churches tend to be evangelical. For these churches, preaching tends to be based on biblical stories from both the Hebrew Scriptures and Christian Gospels. It seeks to convert the unchurched to Christianity. Such ideas as holiness and sanctification are often used to describe this function of preaching. Gospel music and charismatic preaching are often a prominent part of their religious life. The social teachings of African American churches tend to be egalitarian. In fact, this egalitarian emphasis fundamentally identifies the social teachings of the African American churches. This emphasis has perhaps nowhere been so evident as in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. But the sociologists Lincoln and Mamiya argue that the influence of the African American churches is best seen not in broad civil rights activism, but rather in their internal influence on African American culture itself. With the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and early 70s, African American churches began examining their possible connections with traditional African religions.
There is a resurgent, I like to use the word renaissance. There is a renaissance of African religions occurring right now as we speak. It has, in my opinion, reached its second stage. The first stage of the expression of the religion was the way that the religion had to be expressed during the enslavement years. By virtue of the way slavery worked at that time in the various locations, the religions had to go underground. They could not be practiced publicly. If they were practiced publicly, they had to be practiced under a facade or with a mask or pretending to do something that you really weren't doing or pretending to be something that you're not. Within the last, I would say 50 years, since the 1950s, the religion has begun to go through another birthing process. And that birthing process, in my view, based on what I have observed, is for the religion to come to another stage of its full circle expression, which is to become public.
The dramatic and oral aspects of African traditional culture were seen more prominently in non-religious institutions such as African American art, music, theater, literature, cinema, and radical political organizations. Distinctive elements of African traditional religions do appear among African American Catholics and also among devotees of neo-traditional Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Brazilian religious cults. But the numbers in such groups are small, and they are outside the mainstream of African American religious practice. Traditional African religions provide valuable insights for our understanding of human civilizations. They are living reminders of the ancient tribal and ancestral origins of most so-called great religions. The history of African and African American religion is a story of syncretism and conversion. The fact that traditional African religious beliefs have survived suggests that these beliefs continue to be vital sources of religious and moral meaning, both in post-colonial Africa and in the Americas. African traditional religions can effectively focus religious experience in a variety of oral arts and dramatic performances, whether in Africa's indigenous church movements or neo-traditional movements, in Haiti's voodoo and Cuba's Santeria.